Hi. Like the jacket? I paid like $130 for it, so this is my dedication to the bit. So, Resident Evil 4. It was, and still is, considered one of the most influential video games for its time when it was released back in 2005, which was 20 years ago? Oh god. So when the much anticipated remake for the game came out in March of 2023, it sure as hell knocked it out of the fucking park. I can go on and on about how much I personally love the remake for RE4 and kind of think that it's a better game than the original, but I think that I might be drawn and quartered for that if I say it. But the more I played it, the more I started picking up on the subtext. And I began to realize that RE4 was a lot more queer than meets the eye. But no matter where I looked, I kept feeling as if the fandom just didn't really pick up on it. So this video will serve as a very in-depth character analysis, as well as a much-needed queer reading of the game. So stay with me here. But first, we gotta talk about this guy. This guy right here. Most people know him from his appearance in RE4, but when we first meet Leon, he's trying to get to the Raccoon City Police Department for his first day on the job, and he's got this wide-eyed, rosy-cheeked naivete about him. Surely nothing will go wrong for this guy. Leon here is by no means your stereotypical macho man tough guy, nor was he ever intended to be. He's pretty emotive and has a strong moral code, even if his facial expressions don't really reflect that. This isn't meant to be an autistic reading of his character, but like, if you clicked on a video this long, you gotta hear me out for just a little bit. He really cares about others and doesn't want to see anybody else get hurt, even if this only ends in heartbreak for him. He's a guy in over his head and thrust into one of the worst situations a person could ever go through, and he forces himself to bear all that responsibility. It's his fault Raccoon City was destroyed. If he had done something different, more people would have made it out alive. Even if all of it was out of control, he still feels he's responsible. Now, in 2004, he's on his first mission as a government agent, and he's stuck in rural Spain where, surprise, everybody wants to kill him again. What's worse is that we can really tell just how much his trauma has affected him by just his appearance alone in this game. He's got terrible eye bags that almost make him look sickly, and has the worst case of resting bitch face that I've ever seen in my life. 6 years have passed since that night, and the years have not been kind to this man. But the physical toll it's taken on him really shows you just how much his trauma has affected him. Even more so when you take into account that he was forced to go through military training in the years between 1998 and 2004. An environment like that is basically a recipe for repression. Jack Krauser is that repression in human form. When he first shows up in the original RE4, he's meant to have a history with Leon, but we never get to see that. Or at least not until Darkside Chronicles, which I'm not qualified to go over. But Leon's interactions with him is probably where most people pick up on RE4's more homoerotic undertones. From the opening cutscene, we can already gauge what their relationship was like while Leon was in military training. Leon has noticeably longer hair than the rest of his peers, who all have buzz cuts, and his hair is even longer than what it looked like in RE2, implying that he's got special treatment from Krauser, or at least just because he's the government special boy. It's most likely the former. Krauser's got this deep hatred or vendetta against Leon for being the only soldier besides him to survive Operation Javier, which was a mission that ended up wiping out the entire crew and was covered up by the government, and led to Krauser faking his death. He sees Leon as weak, a man who relies on his good looks to get his way, but it ends up festering into this strange, unhealthy obsession with him. It feels like it's disguised as a need for revenge, but judging from the picture you can find of RE2 Leon, he seems to have more hidden motives. He's had this picture for a while.
Fuck.
I'm waiting is written on it. Why does he have that?
Oh man.
Krauser takes his anger out on Leon, projecting his obsession onto him throughout the whole second boss fight, telling Leon,
"Enough reminiscing.
and
You need to stop living in the past."
Which paints him as a massive hypocrite. And their back and forth ends up feeling like two bitter exes fighting with each other. And Krauser mostly taunts Leon about his masculinity.
You're slow. So goddamn weak. You're too soft to do what's necessary. Anything to make the feel special.
It's good to note that Leon is a lot less stereotypically masculine than most of the other male characters in Resident Evil. Krauser especially. He's got longer hair, like I mentioned, high cheekbones, and I guess pretty full lips. By all means, he is a pretty boy, and a man who lets his emotion get the better of him at that. A trait which is typically associated with femininity. And that last line I mentioned is where it starts to take a turn, where Krauser's taunts become more sexually suggestive. Calling Leon pretty boy was by no means just meant to be a dig at his more feminine traits.
Make the first move. Let that spark up. I can't wait to see you ride. After all, I'm better than anyone. Always trying to get the last word. Coming, I'll beat that out of him.
It's shit you hear in the bedroom or a bad romance movie. And then combine that with what happens when Krauser incapacitates Leon, it's pretty clear where the player's mind is meant to go. Before he transforms during the first fight or the beginning of the second, Krauser will act disappointed if Leon ends up dying to his attacks. Krauser has access to Leon's neck or other points that could land a fatal blow, and yet he doesn't go for it. So why? In that first fight, it's almost like Krauser had no intention of killing him, and instead he's doing something similar to him playing with his food. It's quite literally foreplay, because as he says during the fight,
I love a good argument.
In one instance, he'll even tackle Leon to the ground, slotting his leg between Leon's thighs, and if you suck at the game enough to fail a QuickTime event, oh god, Krauser will slit Leon's throat, which spurts blood on his face as Krauser slowly pulls the knife out. Oh my god. Okay.
So then why does this feel so homoerotic?
Like how many slasher movies can be read as queer, we can apply that same logic to RE4. These fights with Krauser combine violence and death with that of sexual acts, and viewing the knife as a phallic object, one that quite literally penetrates, invades, and takes, is similar to what Freud, stop laughing, theorized about in regards to sexuality, where, quote, the sexual aim consists in the incorporating into one's own body of the object, end quote. And a scene like this can easily be reminiscent of, yes, intercourse. In this case, Krauser's desire for revenge becomes almost one and the same with his sexual desire. A desire where the pleasure he gets out of this, quote, can be seen as sadistic, or a secret desire for this punishment to happen to others, end quote. As the fight continues, Krauser's arms, ones that he lost in whatever horrors occurred during Operation Javier, morph into these disgusting wing-like appendages, a testament to the effects that Las Plagas has on the human form. Now, Krauser uses these as if they were his own knife. The phallic metaphor has now become flesh, inseparable from Krauser as a person. But, like any boss in a video game, you're gonna beat him eventually. From here, the dynamic between Leon and Krauser is completely flipped on its head. Krauser pretty much just accepts his fate and relinquishes himself to let Leon, quote,
do what you have to do.
In this situation, his and Leon's roles are flipped, wherein Leon takes on the more dominant role, where he grabs Krauser's knife, straddling his legs, and Krauser allows him to do so. The scene playing out as, quote, a ritualized test of trust, submission, and power, end quote. Another act which can be interpreted as sexual in nature, what with the contented sigh and Krauser saying,
That's right.
as Leon drives the knife straight into his heart. It's important to note that Krauser's death has a deep emotional impact on Leon, and it's one of the only times he's seen crying. The way I see it, for Leon, Krauser was like that last remaining tether connecting his Raccoon City self and who he is now. And now that that string has been cut, Whatever was left of that rookie cop in him is dead and gone forever. I think that's why so much emphasis is placed on Krauser's body too. As Leon walks across the drawbridge, he glances back for a full 8 seconds before finally leaving. And even though the reward for completing this chapter is called letting go of the past, I have a sneaking suspicion that Leon hasn't truly let go.
Well, that's the end of the video, so thank you all so much for watching. There's no other characters, so don't check the runtime because there really isn't anything else to talk about. What?
Luis is an interesting character based on just how much he's been expanded on in the remake, making him so much better. In the original RE4, Louis.
And who might you be?
Me llamo Luis Serra.
Louis.
Louis!
Luis claims to have been a cop in Madrid before quitting, but is revealed to have been a scientist who stole a sample from Los Illuminados, which is the cult that controls Villalobos. He shows up, he leaves, he shows up, he harasses Ashley for no fucking reason. He shows up, he leaves again, he shows up, and immediately gets killed off before he actually gets any sort of character development and is written out of the game completely, save for a few notes later on. Oh, original RE4. But in the remake, he's set up as a direct foil of Leon. He's loud, rambunctious, and a bit of a troublemaker, judging by how he makes his great escape in the first scene he's in, leaving Leon completely in the dust. But he's also very similar to Leon. He's a man who wears his heart on his sleeve and seems to bear the brunt of accountability for his past involvements to an almost compulsive degree, especially in regards to his work with Umbrella and Los Illuminados, which gets revealed later in the game. His motives are really similar to Leon's in RE2 in a lot of ways. He's also insanely queer-coded. So let's rewind back to that first scene, because, oh man, there is a lot to talk about in just that first scene alone. Both Luis and Leon find themselves chained together in a basement of what's later revealed to be an old factory, and things get really suggestive really fast. Specifically with the action of Leon pulling on the chain in such a way that it forcibly draws Luis closer to him, with his arms raised and their faces almost touching. It undoubtedly brings to mind kink or BDSM imagery. This idea is supported by Luis asking if he's...
Bet you've been in spots like this before, huh?
Once again, we've got to ask the question of what makes this homoerotic or just recognizably sexual? Bondage is something that takes on an inherently erotic tone in society, specifically Western or American society. And while this scene isn't an actual BDSM scene, because neither of them want to be here, bro, it certainly is reminiscent of what someone might recognize as one. Though the two of them actually subvert stereotypical dynamics, as neither one of them have an overtly dominant role. Like Luis says,
Stop it! You move, I move. And I'm beat up enough as it is.
There's a deferred sense of sexual desire that plays out through situations of forced intimacy, like this scene, in which a character's motives toe the line between violence and desire. It creates a situation that can be inherently viewed as having queer undertones, even without either party admitting that. Both Leon and Luis's ability to escape is being denied due to the chains binding them together. If either one of them was a woman, we'd probably be seeing a setup to a series-typical romance plot, and a much more romantic interpretation from the majority of fans. This isn't even where the implications stop, too. Once the village gangs up on Leon and Ashley, they flee to the extraction point and run into Luis, who has been waiting for them. Leon immediately antagonizes Luis and pins him against the wall, mostly because at this point, Leon knows about Luis's work with Umbrella. Therefore, Leon knows not to trust him. But Luis doesn't know that Leon knows, and just thinks he's upset that Luis abandoned him back in the factory. But pinning someone against a wall like this tends to bring romantic undertones to mind, particularly in fandom or shipping spaces. And the scene really made me wonder why. There's this physicality in pinning someone down that, regardless of intent, elicits the same connotation, given that the tension between the people involved holds space for that to potentially be true. That logic applies to this scene too, because in a lot of instances like this, the character is using this aggression as a cover for their frustration over being unable to express their interest in a straightforward manner. And if you can't express your emotions verbally, you use your body. Though that last part brings up the issue of body language. And once again, it brings us back to the notion that Luis is meant to be Leon's foil. While Leon hardly uses any gestures while speaking, and pretty much exclusively has one facial expression throughout the entire game, which totally isn't also an autism symptom, Luis expresses his emotions through body language. But Luis also uses this as a way to signal his interest for Leon in a much more subtle, easy-to-miss way. Like this scene again, when Leon presses him further into the wall, he throws his head back before turning to Leon with a grin, and raises his eyebrows when they make eye contact. And we've seen that same action before, when he asked Leon if he's been tied up like this. He wiggles his eyebrows and bites his lip, which only further proves that that was the conclusion we were supposed to come to earlier. There's a lot you can gauge from simple facial expressions like this, especially when you end up noticing that Luis only puts on such a bravado when he knows Leon is looking at him. He thrives off that attention. He'll comfort Ashley and give her a friendly wink and assure her that he has a plan, but put in more effort in gesturing at Leon in an attempt to get them, but mostly Leon, to trust him. And I guess that's why he flashes him too. The fight at the extraction point is also where Luis starts using pet names for Leon, marking a notable shift in their relationship from enemies to begrudgingly helping each other.
Take a nap, cowboy. Cowboy? Cowboy? I've been waiting, hero boy. Prince Charming.
Once the fight ends, Luis fucks off yet again, but that doesn't mean we don't get to see him. He'll periodically call Leon, giving him little tips along the way to help guide him and Ashley through the castle. But by doing so, he makes himself look better for the camera, as opposed to the more "Mom, I threw up" vibe that he gives off when calling Ada in separate ways. Luis's second video call also includes one of the most overt examples of his flirting.
Sorry, I screwed up. Come to my rescue, Prince Charming.
With the promise of meeting Leon in the ballroom, telling him,
Don't be late to the dance.
We never get to see what exactly he means by this, but the implications are pretty apparent here. And it's something that I've seen other people just gloss right over when analyzing RE4, or even just Luis as a character. Make note of how this conversation plays out. Luis's comment is surprisingly not a setup to make him the butt of the joke for being obviously queer, even though it's incredibly easy to do so. Capcom could have easily been like, look at this footy guy flirting with our super cool, awesome, buff macho man protagonist. Everyone should point and laugh at him and throw rocks at him and call him slurs. It's never like that. Sure, Leon bites back at the remark, but it's not the reaction you'd expect. Certainly not from a man like him in 2004. Of course, what it does do is reinforce the fact that he is an easy person to tease. So maybe he's just used to that, and he's learned to roll with the punches. But Luis doesn't tease Leon the way Krauser does, where it's meant to deliberately ridicule or emasculate him. Luis teases him in an affectionate way, to say things so ridiculous that Leon has no choice but to laugh. He knows that Leon's built this impenetrable fortress with this tough guy persona for himself, and Luis wants to crack that bad boy right open. We don't get to see Luis until the very, very end of chapter 10, where he appears in front of Leon like a beacon of hope before the Plaga can take control of him, illuminated by the only light in the room. Without him, who knows what would have happened to Leon? This scene marks yet another instance of Luis's flirting, where he taps the container to the suppressant with a wink, saying,
I'll make it cheap for you.
It's another scene where we can never truly know what he's implying with that, because Luis isn't presumably getting anything out of this, other than making him feel better about himself. So there isn't really an exchange taking place here, nothing for Leon to make cheap, if that makes sense. But once again, it's really difficult to tell what happens with that fade to black. As the scene fades back in, it's clear that time has passed, and the suppressant is doing its job to slow the spread. Leon is physically fine, but he still seems conflicted somewhat, and when Luis expresses his concern, Leon immediately deflects it, saying that he's not the priority. Whether we like it or not, Leon still has that shell to protect himself from coming across as weak or, yes, effeminate. But I believe that it's this scene where we see that shell finally start to crack a little bit. And that might just be because of Luis's presence.
Come, Sancho Panza! Let us rescue the Princess Dulcinea!
You're gonna hurt yourself.
Hey, that was my dance. Okay, we hurry, I get it.
Chapter 11 is also the part where we are properly introduced to Luis's love for the novel Don Quixote, written by Miguel de Cervantes in 1605, with a second part releasing a whole 10 years later in 1615. Up till this point in the game, there have been multiple references to the book, such as the note written by Mendez, the village chief, who talks about a young boy in the village who will not shut up about it. The boy in question is obviously a young Luis, who grew up in Valdalobos before Las Plagas killed his grandfather and decimated the village. But this scene is pretty much confirmation that the kid in the notes that they were talking about was Luis, because who else would read that whole entire book?
For those who haven't read the entire book like I have, the book centers around the titular Don Quixote, aka Alonso Quijano, who, after reading so many books about knights and chivalric romance, that he loses his mind and decides to set out on his own knightly journey alongside his squire Sancho Panza, who originally was just a normal farmer, and hijinks ensue.
By the end of the novel, Don Quixote and Sancho return home from their journey, but Don falls deathly ill and basically snaps out of his persona, claiming to be Alonso Quijano once again. He denounces his time as a knight and apologizes profusely to Sancho, his niece, and his housekeeper for the harm he caused as a result of his actions. At its core, the story is by all means a tragedy. A comedic one, sure, but a happy story it is not. Don gets his ass handed to him in battle more often than not, and he's subjected to both physical and psychological torture throughout the entirety of the novel. But why? Vladimir Nabokov, who, yes, is the author of Lolita, but just hear me out for a second, claims that the cruelty is part of the book's aesthetic, as well as a scathing critique of knight-errantry and the chivalric romances that drove its own main character to madness. We can apply all of this to Luis, who time and time again has watched history repeat itself as a result of his own actions and self-preservation instincts. Yet, he ends up just making those same mistakes over and over again. When Luis was in that bag in the basement of his own childhood home, if Leon hadn't been there to save him, that would have been where he met his end. And it's at this point where you may start to realize that even though Luis equates himself to Don Quixote, he ends up undergoing what has been described by others analyzing the book as sanctification. Back to the book. The choice to make Don Quixote mad automatically subverts the reader's expectations and furthers Cervantes' goal of breaking down the idea of a stereotypical chivalric hero. He's not even well liked by the townfolk. They fucking hate this guy, and they constantly take advantage of him since they see him as an easy target. Despite this occasionally extremely graphic violence done towards him countless times, Don keeps going back into it, expecting a different outcome. He still has hope. And he's not stupid. He knows that people don't get him, but that doesn't stop him from wanting everyone to understand things from his perspective. Don Quixote's joust in Chapter 8 is arguably one of the most iconic moments in the novel, and it exemplifies this idea of his mindset, where when the knight exclaims about the giants over yonder, Sancho rebutes that they are, in reality, just windmills. Unwilling to admit defeat, Don Quixote charges into battle and immediately gets hit in the face with one of the sails. Quote, "When he is defeated, he can no longer defensively withdraw into solipsism because he has to confront Sancho." End quote. Just like Don Quixote, Luis keeps making the same mistakes over and over again, selling his work to the highest bidder, each one even more dangerous than the last, and believes that this time has to be different. This is where Luis begins to deviate from his novel counterpart. Unlike Don Quixote at this stage of the novel, Luis is able to admit defeat much more easily, and therefore is much more similar to Don at the very end of Part 1. Luis has already undergone the sanctification we talked about earlier by the time he meets his Sancho, Leon. But Luis's deep connection to Don Quixote, not just the character, but the novel in its entirety, is undeniable. So remember how I said that Luis's first scene could easily be interpreted as a metaphor for BDSM? Well, Don Quixote doesn't shy away from that imagery either. One of the most potent examples of this is during Chapter 43 of Part 1. After a long day on the road, Don and Sancho make their way to an inn for the night. Don is the only one left awake, which allows the innkeeper's daughter and her servant, Maritones, to play a trick on him, and thus the innkeeper's daughter calls to him through a hole in the wall, in the hayloft, or pajar. Keep the use of this word in mind for later. In his mind, Don Quixote sees these inns as castles, and therefore the woman as a princess seeking to gain his affection. a sort of courtly love perhaps. Maritornes snaps him out of it and corrects him that the innkeeper's daughter wants, quote, only one of your beautiful hands, so as to be able to relieve with it the great desire that has brought her to this hole, at such great peril to her honor, that if her father should sense her, the least part of her to be sliced off would be her ear, end quote. Instead, Don Quixote offers his entire body over to her, as opposed to just one hand, with this statement, quote, Lady, take this hand, which no other hand of woman has ever touched, not even hers who has complete possession of my entire body. I present it to you, not that you may kiss it, but that you may observe the contexture of the sinews, the close network of the muscles, and the breadth and the capacity of the veins. Whence you may infer that must be the strength of the arm that has such a hand, end quote. He's fallen right into their trap. Well, he rambles on and on about the veins in his hand or whatever, and sticks his hand into the hole. Maritornes ties Don's hand together using the harness from Sancho's donkey, and leaves him there to hang the entire night. That is, until the harness eventually gives out under the weight and practically dislocates Don's shoulder when he hits the ground. Don hanging there for as long as he does is nothing short of humiliating for him. For one, he is quite literally hanging for his crimes. The crime of his romanticized heroism, his quixoticism. And it's this blind chivalric hope that ends up keeping him bound for so long, and making his suffering all the worse. He, as Mary Malcolm Gaylord puts it, quote, becomes the paradoxical agent of his own excruciating torture, and at the same time grotesquely eroticized anguish, end quote. Here is when we should take notice of Cervantes' use of the word hand, or mano, in the book's original Spanish. Because with all of this other pre-existing subtext present in previous chapters, a reader's mind can easily start wondering what else the word could represent. Circling back to the earlier excerpt I read, Don claims that the hand which he offers to the innkeeper's daughter has never been kissed or touched by any woman, let alone the one whom enjoys complete possession of his whole body, and it is offered not to be kissed, but merely to be admired. A statement which is then followed by a gruesomely detailed description of his hands that, in turn, allows for both Maritornes and the reader to think of substitutions to what his hand could represent in its place. All while Don Quixote is none the wiser and instead stuck in that same chivalric mindset of describing his own hand as if it's some sort of larger-than-life object of quite literal affection. Quote, while Don Quixote can contemplate with vainglorious complacency this uplifting version of his own epic enlargement, he unwittingly reinforces another, less lofty perspective on the conspicuous member's graphically detailed swelling, by having him aim his hand's muscles, veins, and nerves, aroused in direct response to the expressions of female desire towards their fateful destination in a pajar. The narrator, with the cheerful complacency of Maritornes, multiplies obscene suggestions that run from the trivialized to, finally, the frustrated but still guilty eroticism of masturbation. The use of pajar here creates a double entendre that ends up getting lost in English translations. Paja means hay or straw, hence pajar meaning hayloft or haystack. However, it is also used as a slang term that refers to, jorking it. So Don unknowingly performs an action his entire mission sought to eradicate.
Okay, God. Okay, so, for lack of a better term, Don sticks his member inside of a hole in which he can feel both the women touching it. I got nothing.
Not only has he failed to protect the world from evildoers, but in his eyes, he has become an evildoer himself as a result of his chivalry and repressed sexuality. If Luis is such a chaotic character, this same metaphor can be applied to him as well, since this entire segment is incredibly similar to the chain scene. Luis is very much like Don, in the way where he is so hell-bent on helping others and vanquishing evil from the world that it causes his downfall. But he's also like Sancho in the ways of his devotion towards Leon. In every scene he's in with Ada in separate ways, Leon is all he can think about, whether it be the longing gazes off into the distance, or going off on his own glorified side quest just to find the suppressant for him, to the point where Ada can tell that Luis is thinking about him. Speaking of devotion, it's no surprise that Don Quixote has several overtly queer themes. There are several instances throughout the novel in which Don and Sancho's relationship is described as something akin to the way a husband loves his wife, as well as this excerpt, quote, "And coming close to him, he laid one hand on the pommel of the saddle, and the other on the cantle, so that he held his master's left thigh in his embrace, not daring to separate a finger's width from him," end quote. And all of this is in combination with The Prince by Gustave Doré that were included in my reading, several of which I feel can be interpreted as homoerotic. In many other pieces of media, comparisons end up getting made between Don and Sancho and two, usually both male characters. One example of this is in Venom Let There Be Carnage from 2021.
Now there's Don Quixote, and the guy next to him is Sancho Panza. And two very different people have very different takes on the world. Different ways of doing things. Sometimes they didn't like each other a whole lot, but ultimately, they work together to bring out the best in each other.
Even without this allegory to the novel, the Venom series is considered to be a very queer-coded movie. But using the pre-existing subtext in Don Quixote, it only furthers that. Especially considering that this scene directly precedes the part where Venom pretty much confesses his love for Eddie. So, is Don Quixote a definitively queer text? The short answer is that it's complicated. The issue here is that Don Quixote is such an old book, and one of the most translated books of all time at that. Purposeful changes and details that get lost in translation are bound to happen. And it's impossible to analyze through a modern queer lens, or tell whether or not Cervantes meant for his book to be interpreted in such a way. But judging from the prevalence of the Catholic Church in the 16th to 17th century Spain, it wouldn't be a far stretch to say that Cervantes wrote Sancho and Don like that out of spite. By chapter 11, Sancho becomes the most common pet name Luis uses for Leon.
Come, Sancho Panza. Sancho? Yes, Sancho. Harsh words for a squire.
While this obviously is in reference to Sancho Panza, thus making him Luis's sidekick, the word Sancho is allegedly a slang term in the Spanish-speaking world used to refer to the other man someone is cheating on their partner with in an affair. While this definition is notably referring to a heteronormative relationship, I have heard through word of mouth that it can also be used for queer men as well, though please take this with a grain of salt. I am paraphrasing Wikipedia here. If this is true, Leon is implied to know what the connotations of Luis calling him that are. He's basically subtly calling Leon gay. Hence why Leon replies with,
Who are you calling Sancho?
he can pick up what Luis is putting down, and is therefore receptive to his advances. We even learned later by reading his emails in his laboratory that Luis and Ada already had a code phrase to make sure nothing confidential could slip through the cracks. It's why, the very first time they meet, Luis asked Leon,
You got a smoke?
it's him checking to see if Leon is on their side. So when Leon replies,
You know, those things will kill you.
Luis knows Leon isn't associated with them. It's why Luis acts so disappointed after he says that. And it's not just because of the nicotine addiction. But it would also make sense that Luis is using it as a code. He's trying to signal to Leon that he's like him, just not saying it directly, since this part of Spain is definitely not a safe place to come out. However, Leon's original response to being called Sancho could also be a reference to his knowledge of Don Quixote, which is implied in a scene we'll discuss later. In that case, Leon is instead upset at Luis calling him his sidekick. It can go both ways. Like him. After this scene, Luis tags along for the remainder of the chapter, and, like Ashley before him, he can join Leon in the shooting gallery. There, he will lean against a barrel and just stare at Leon with the most fuck-me eyes I've ever seen. Obviously, the mechanic of a character tagging along and shouting praises isn't new at this point of the game. We've already been through this rigmarole with Ashley earlier, like I mentioned. But Luis being here has a completely different vibe, because it's very obvious Luis is meant to be flirting with Leon.
Ooh, nice one. Go for it! Give him hell, cowboy! Ripple, look at this guy. You're too into that. Right, surprise. taking this too seriously. Good shooting, cowboy. I had fun just watching you work.
And also, while I was editing this video, apparently Luis's voice actor decided to drop his audition tape, which gave me even more things that I needed to talk about, and I don't have time to do that. Thanks, Andre! From his use of pet names to that doozy of a line, it's pretty clear how badly Luis wants this man. But despite all the effort in wearing Leon down, Leon is still pretty cautious around Luis. When Leon mentions that it's
A little hard for me to put my faith in someone who used to work for Umbrella.
So you heard, huh? Umbrella's done for. You don't need to worry about them anymore.
we see that mask, the facade of an overconfident ladies' man Luis has put on, start to slip. And yes, even him calling himself
Just an average guy who happens to be quite the ladies' man.
has its roots in Don Quixote, with Lothario, a character from the meta-story and Ill-Advised Curiosity from Part 1. It's not even a good charade either, since time and time again we see Leon and, to an extent, Ada, see right through him. He's fooling nobody with it. Like Leon, Luis has built this mask and has based his entire personality off the novel. He's created this suave ladies' man persona, all for the sake of self-preservation. But now, after being knocked down a few pegs from the likes of Umbrella's downfall and getting inducted into Los Iluminados, that mask is starting to prove useless since Leon knows he's faking it. In that way, it becomes a mutual action. Both of them are trying to break down each other's walls, whether intentional on Leon's part, at least. As the two of them continue making their way through the mines, they reach a grate to the blast furnace, which Leon kicks off. Luis stands back and watches. He hums and smiles, and yeah, he's just straight up looking at Leon's ass the entire time. Luis allows him to take the lead by saying,
After you, I insist.
this isn't the first time Leon has been given this type of ladies first treatment. We saw a similar conversation between him and Ada in the sewers in RE2. This strengthens my point about Leon being an easy person to tease, but once again, Luis isn't saying it to emasculate him. He does it out of genuine interest for Leon, and also so that he can look at Leon's ass more. Luis has this very specific smile you might have picked up on if you've been paying attention to his facial expressions. He only ever uses it when he knows Leon is looking at him, and we've seen this in pretty much every scene they've been in with each other, this one included. This scene is also a testament to how their bond has grown over the time they've worked with each other. When one of the monsters, known as El Gigante, suddenly jumps out and grabs Leon, Leon makes eye contact with Luis, but interestingly enough, Leon just stands there like a deer in headlights. In this case, it's almost like Leon is using himself as a human shield to protect Luis. Even when Luis does grab his hand, Leon doesn't move. It exemplifies how much Leon is willing to go to protect people, no matter how fucking annoying he finds them. Once the fight starts, Luis saves Leon by shooting El Gigante to make him drop Leon, tacking on a
Now you owe me.
Leon saves Luis as well by warning him of the incoming attack.
Luis, heads up!
And surprisingly enough, Leon smiles. Granted, it's very slight and honestly nothing special, but for someone as emotionally constipated as Leon, even something this faint goes to show just how much Luis has changed him. As the chapter continues, Leon and Luis continue to work with each other, going from the fight with El Gigante to the combination minecart and roller coaster ride. Now they finally made it to their destination, the elevator. So,
Oye, let's get on that lift.
I don't get you. Why risk your life like this? You don't know us.
I told you. It makes me feel better.
Be straight with me for once.
Los Iluminados. I was working for them.
See? There you go.
Helping the two of you doesn't make up for it. I know that. But still, I don't want anyone else to get hurt.
In that case, you better get serious.
Harsh words for a squire.
nothing good ever happens in elevators in Capcom games. Happy belated DL6 incident, by the way. I think we all know what's going to happen, even though I don't wanna.
We're out of that hellhole. The fresh air is calling our names. Por fin. Gus, if we made it all this way, you know it means we're almost...
Almost what?
Louis!
Long time no see, rookie.
Major Krauser? What the hell? Why?
Recovering stolen goods. And killing a few rats along the way. Enough play, rookie. You haven't changed a damn bit. What a disappointment.
Not looking good, eh, my friend? And such a loss to the ladies of the world.
Don't talk.
Take this. The key to my laboratory. Go there and remove those damn parasites. Help Ashley. You know, I led a pretty shitty life. But now, eh? What do you think, Leon? People can change, right?
Book ends. Luis's story started with Leon saving his life, and now it's time for him to save Leon's. Based on where Krauser's knife stabbed Luis, somewhere around his C7 to, I want to say, T3 spinal vertebrae, Luis would have lost most of the fine motor control in his hands, which makes the act of him shooting Krauser an incredibly difficult yet meaningful thing for him to have done. It's why he also has such a difficult time with his lighter. And it's at this point where I would like to point out just how much these two have touched each other throughout the game. At the extraction point, Leon presses his hand into Luis's chest when he pins him against the wall. Luis grabs Leon's arm when El Gigante grabs him. Leon holds Luis's hand, not his arm or his wrist, to pull him up after the minecart crashes. Luis grabs Leon's hand to give him the key to the laboratory. He doesn't hand it to Leon, he goes out of his way to press that key into Leon's palm and hold it there. And Leon hands Luis back his lighter and then closes his fist around it and keeps his hand there. Every scene Luis has been in, he has thrived off Leon looking at him, but now the mere idea of Leon's eyes on him makes him feel ashamed, unable to hold eye contact because he feels he's let Leon down. This scene also shows a part of Leon that we hardly ever get to see in this game. The very action of Leon closing Luis's fist around his lighter and then holding his hand shows how much Leon cares about Luis. It's intimate, because it means Luis meant something to him. And losing him only drives in this idea that Leon can't save anybody. During Chapter 11 of Part 1, I know, Don Quixote gives a lengthy speech to Sancho and a group of goatherds about the Golden Age, where he brings to mind the idea of the world he wishes to restore, a world where there is, quote, no labor, no strife, women's freedom of choice in love was entirely respected. There was no fraud, no deceit or malice mingled with truth and sincerity. Perfect justice resigned, and legal interpretation was unnecessary, for there was none to judge or be judged, end quote. It's an ambitious goal, but I believe that we all know that a perfect world like this can never come to fruition. It's impossible no matter how hard one man tries. Yet Luis wants this too. He wants to live a life free from the burdens of his past, where he can love and be loved without this feeling of overwhelming guilt for it. A world where he can finally be forgiven. I think he knows he can't have that. Not if he keeps pawning himself off like this. And maybe it's why he's so adamant on helping Leon. He sees another man just like him, in more ways than one, disconnected from anything else Luis has ruined. And he thinks that he can finally prove to someone that he can change, and that he's worthy of being loved. And Leon lets him. Recall that scene in the elevator. When Luis confesses that he worked with Los Iluminados, Leon doesn't react angrily, and at this point, he probably already knows if he's read all the notes left around by the Lobos. In fact, he's actually happy that Luis tells him up front that Luis's facade has been broken. In a much simpler world, perhaps we could have seen more of them, and how the relationship could continue to grow if Capcom weren't cowards. All things considered, it makes Luis's death all the more tragic when you remember that he dies directly after this conversation, right after Leon begins to trust him. Even if he may not believe it, Luis has changed, and the fact that he goes out of his way just to help Leon and Ashley and puts the sanctity of their lives over his own proves that he has, even though he never gets to hear it. It's his impossible dream.
You were a fine knight, Don Quixote.
So, if RE4 is so gay, then why hasn't anybody talked about it in the almost 2 years that this game has been out? I think some of that is due in part to the audience that a survival horror game or shooter game ends up attracting. Even if the source material may seem pretty overtly homoerotic to a queer person such as myself, the majority of people playing this aren't going to pick up on those smaller bits and pieces that would be significant to a queer reading, because it's not even a thought that passes through their minds while playing. Even if they did, it's easy just to pass it off as guys being dudes. But whether or not the queer themes being so prevalent in this game were intentional doesn't matter, because Resident Evil as a series has always been gay as shit. This is the same studio that gave us Unnecessary Feelings, guys. Even as far back as the very first game, we already have this over-the-top flamboyant villain in Wesker.
Chris, oh little fishy, come see my hook.
This aspect of his character only being furthered in Code Veronica. Leon being the center of all the subtext ends up subverting the expectation of him being the stereotypically peak heterosexual protagonist a game like this seems to spawn.
And there is also something to be said about how Luis's death can be viewed as yet another subversion of the bury your gays trope, where a character is killed off exclusively for their queerness, which is a remnant of what the Hays Code deemed as sexual perversion. A character could be gay, sure, but they have to be punished by the time the credits roll. It's why we've got all those flamboyant Disney villains from the 90s. So does that apply here? Luis dies, yeah, and he's presumably queer, but his death isn't a punishment for his queerness, but for Leon trusting him, and for Luis going behind the cult's back. Not only that, but Luis is killed off by the other heavily queer-coded character in this game, Krauser. It's almost like he's doing it to prove a point to Leon, to show what will happen if Leon doesn't join him.
Leon's queerness has always been heavily implied throughout the series, whether that's in the original RE4, where the taxi driver teases Leon about forgetting his makeup in the car,
Forget your makeup or something?
or in Damnation, where his codename ends up implying that he is a friend of Dorothy. Of course, Leon isn't the only character here that we have to take into account when viewing this game as a queer story. We have to consider Krauser's queerness, Luis's queerness. It's all a crucial part of truly understanding the themes of this game, and by purposefully ignoring it or doing whatever the hell they're doing to Leon on TikTok, you're gonna end up missing out on one of the most overtly and well-written queer-coded stories in modern gaming. I got a paper cut on my lip for this, so that's... We're just gonna stick them up like that. This is actually the end of the video. I'm not joking this time, but what I did want to say is, first of all, thank you all so much for making it to the end of the video. I know that most of you watching probably didn't subscribe for this, especially if you came from the Slimy video, which thank you all so much for the support on that, by the way, as well as for getting me to 1,000 subscribers, because that's bananas. And I did have a special person
who wanted to say thanks too. So, Slimy, what do you have to say about that, buddy?
Thank you all. Thank you guys so much. That means a lot to me. Thank you guys. Wow. Oh my god. That was so nice of him. He's such a talented worm. I was sticking with my jacket. But really, thank you all for making it to the end of the video. And I don't know what this year entails for me, but I really hope that you all continue supporting me and my strange endeavors of making weird animations and talking about video game gay people.